Dr. Aaron Cariotti is back because Dr. Cariotti, you got me put in timeout, in YouTube timeout. And then I was mysteriously let out of timeout with YouTube saying that it was a mistake. Whoops. And the producer wants to weigh in too. We might let her in a second. So they said that it was a mistake made during the review process. The video has been reinstated. Very sorry for the frustration here. Feedback has been shared with the right teams to help prevent this in the future. I'm not going to go specifically into what we discussed about your lawsuit, but you are suing the University of California over the vaccine mandate. And what I should have said originally was, we called you a psychiatry professor and a clinical psychiatrist, but you are also a medical ethics director, right? You're the director of medical
That's correct.
ethics, and this is about medical ethics. And so, who better to speak about medical ethics and to speak about your particular lawsuit than you? I figured that would be a good opportunity to hear the different variety of people pushing back on this. But I think we pushed up against the AI. That's kind of my guess. I'm curious though, what was your reaction when you found out that it was wiped from YouTube and I was put in jail?
Well, I felt bad that you were put in jail because I understand that folks on YouTube that have a large following can earn income from that. And so if this contributes to your livelihood, I felt sort of bad about that. On the other hand, it wasn't at all clear to me which of their content guidelines we may have violated. And this may be rule, as you said, by AI or some bot that somehow flagged our video and took it down as a precautionary measure. But I mean, the one question I would have for YouTube is, please point to the sentence that I uttered in the interview, or perhaps that you uttered, although you just asked questions, so I don't know how questions can be true or false. But point to the sentence that I uttered that was false or not supported by scientific information. And if they can't do that, that is very concerning. Even if they could do that, I have concerns about the effects of this kind of censorship on public discourse and, quite frankly, on the advancement of science. I mean, even scientists use social media now to communicate their ideas with the general public, with other scientists. And anyone who knows anything about science or the methods of science or how science makes progress understands that at its essence, at its core, science is about debate. It's about hypothesis generation. It's about offering conjectures, plausible ideas, and then testing them and refuting them. So science just is conjectures and refutations. If you get into a room with a bunch of scientists, all they ever do is argue. They argue about data, they argue about their theories, they argue about which theory best fits the data. They argue about big questions, and they argue about tiny little subtleties that only the specialist and subspecialist and subspecialist would understand. But science is an ongoing debate. That's just what it is. So anyone who shuts down an ongoing debate in the name of science is killing science. They don't know the first thing about science. Science and censorship just are incompatible. Now, if you don't have censorship, does that mean that a lot of bad ideas or half-baked ideas might get out there? Sure. But the costs of trying to manage or regulate public discourse around scientific questions are just too great to allow certainly computer software, but even well-meaning fact checkers who don't necessarily understand the subtleties and nuances of these debates to try to police and regulate what can be said and what can't be said. So I'm very concerned about the issue of big tech censorship in general. I'm glad that YouTube put our video back up. Hopefully that means that an actual real live person watched the interview. If that didn't happen and they only put it back up because you flagged the fact on Twitter that I'm not just a psychiatrist, but also a medical ethicist, and this was a conversation about the ethics of vaccine mandates, if that's the only reason they put it back up, that concerns me too, Allison, because that says that only certain people with a certain title have the right to say certain things. And I think that's a highly problematic notion. Um, Now, obviously, people that only have so much time to gather information and do their own research might trust a person with a title or trust a person with certain credentials more. That makes sense. That's kind of a reasonable heuristic or a reasonable shortcut when you're trying to learn about a complex topic. Uh, but on the other hand, we don't want to live in a society where only credentialed experts are allowed to have an opinion on a topic. Some of the most perceptive and intelligent and critical thinkers out there are people that don't have a lot of letters after their name. Um, they're people who are extraordinarily bright and have a set of cognitive or intellectual skills that might not fit neatly into the academy, or they just may be pursuing other kind of work that doesn't require that they have a PhD, or doesn't require that they pursue an academic title, but nonetheless they have an important contribution to make in terms of public discourse. They have an important contribution to make in terms of science or correcting errors that may be put forward in the name of science. So I personally, and I would hope most of us, want to live in a free society where everyone has the right to offer an opinion, and everyone has the right to say things publicly, regardless of whether or not they have a professional title. Now, does that mean we have to give the same credence to every single person's opinion? No. I mean, people should also exercise judgment about who is speaking and on what basis are they saying what they're saying and so forth. But again, trying to have some kind of algorithm police that, or even trying to have professional so-called fact checkers police who is credible and who is not credible, that strikes me as definitely as a path that we do not want to go down. And it's a path that's going to hinder progress in terms of our understanding of complex issues. And certainly it's going to hinder scientific progress. I mean, it's worth pointing out the history of science itself is replete with examples of not, people who are not sort of professional credentialed scientists making enormous breakthroughs. Sometimes they were engineers. In one case, it was someone working as a patent clerk when Einstein developed his general theory or his special theory of relativity. He was not working as a scientist. He was doing it on the side as a kind of part-time job. He was the guy. He was the kind of guy who would have been dismissed as lacking the requisite scientific expertise to opine on physics, right? And if YouTube would have shut him down when he was working out his theory, the world would have been deprived of his enormous insights, which completely changed our understanding of the fundamental nature of the universe. And there are many other examples as well of people who contributed in major ways to our progress in understanding the world and the progress of the natural sciences, without necessarily being credentialed in the way that others of their time would have been.
Before we get to the rest of this video, don't forget you can support my work by toasting free speech with a glass of wine or a cup of coffee. My first sponsor is AllisonWinePromo.com. That's Allison with one L, winepromo.com. You get 50% off of my favorite Argentinian Malbecs and 50% off shipping. These are 3 new bottles from the last trio, if you got those. One of these bottles comes from the oldest vineyard in Argentina. They use no flavoring, no filtering, no dyes, and no excess chemicals. Again, AllisonWinePromo.com. But if coffee is more your jive, then check out TwinEngineCoffee.com/Allison, TwinEngineCoffee.com/Allison. These are high-altitude, shade-grown, USDA certified organic Nicaraguan roasts. They have a wide variety of different kinds of roasts. I'm a dark roast drinker, but you can find whatever you want at TwinEngineCoffee.com/Allison. They also have a tea you can make, a Cartura tea that you make out of the coffee fruit. So definitely check out my sponsors, and let's get to the rest of this video. The inverse of what you just said is how many people at the top of the intellectual pyramid with all the degrees over the years have gotten it wrong. So the people who were allowed to speak, or the people who had the power to influence whatever institution they work in, and the consensus, like, over time, has been proven wrong many times. And so that's the other problem with just saying this is the current consensus, so no one else can question it, because historically that
Yeah.
hasn't been something that withstands time always. And then the other problem too, you brought up, did they reinstate it because of your degrees or who you are? Maybe, but I think it's more so, if it is that, it's a combination with shaming them publicly, and I
Hmm.
hate that. It's not, to me, a point of celebration. The last time I was suspended, we had to do the same thing. My buddies and I go to Twitter, we get a bunch of retweets, and it still feels icky to win, because it doesn't really feel like a win. Because what it teaches me is something I saw as a reporter, which is whoever makes the person in power the most uncomfortable is the one that is going to win. And the problem is that the person who's typically making them the most uncomfortable, whether it's the government or these tech companies, are people who are in power.
Yeah.
Who has the time and the energy, or even really the resources, to constantly be fighting these battles? And yeah, I'm barely at the cusp of having enough of a following where I can even push back and get a manual, an actual person reviewing my content. But there are many
Yeah.
people who can't do that. And then how long can I keep that up? Because at some point, it's not going to be enough. It won't be enough. And so, like, seeing that happen as a reporter, there were times where I would do a story, and then the government would reverse its decision. And some of their decision making was completely irreversible, really, because it affected the lives of wildlife, actually. Long story I've gone into on my channel before. But it's like, to me, I looked at them in one particular case, and I'm like, I kind of wish you had stuck by your original decision, at least, because when you said it was biology and science, or even law, that required it, either it really never was about that. It was always about public pressure, in which case, can we trust you ever to make these decisions you say are based in science or law or whatever? Or is it always behind the scenes, just being run by whoever can pull them by the scruff of the neck and get them to do what they want? And that's why,
Yeah.
like, I don't celebrate these situations, because I don't really think it's a win. I did want to really fast show what I originally got for my denial of my appeal, because you see that they say we reviewed your content carefully and confirmed that it violates our medical misinformation policy. So what is it? Is it not really being reviewed carefully, or was it reviewed carefully by the wrong person? I'm really falling on the side of now that even these appeals are done in some kind of computer process.
Yeah.
And like you said, even if it was a real person, there's still plenty of problems with that. But yeah, everything being kind of wired to AI when it comes to nuances of conversations. And now we're hearing that YouTube's going to crack down even more on
Yeah.
information related to the COVID vaccines, whatever it might be. And it's funny hearing the mainstream news. I was just listening to a CNN report on it, and they're like, finally, YouTube, where have you been? As if YouTube's just been letting anything go on YouTube. It's so ridiculous. They've been striking stuff left and right. But
Yeah.
my old industry apparently thinks they're not doing enough. So there's pressure coming at them from all ends. And like I said, that's why you realize that if you're an independent person like me, and you're going up against CNN, which is saying, come on, YouTube, when are you going to start kicking Allison off? Eventually, I'm not going to be able to stay on, right? Because I really believe eventually CNN wins, because they have the power and they have the stick. So I don't like that I won this way. It doesn't really feel like a win. But I don't know. We'll see what happens in the future. I'm gonna have to, I think, rethink re-strategizing my content to
Yeah.
try to avoid this in the future. But I still want to maintain a presence on the platform, because I would like to be there as a bridge for people who are curious about this topic but don't really know where to look. I have a mainstream background. I think I'm less scary for a lot of
Yeah.
people. And then I can get them to other platforms where I could show them other points of view that they're not allowed to see on YouTube. Any other final thoughts before we go? I appreciate your taking the time to do this hot wash, as my husband calls it, after he teaches a class, on what we learned through this whole
Yeah.
process.
Yeah. No, I think it's very instructive that you only received a kind of canned form letter response. And I think you know that you're bumping up just against raw and arbitrarily exercised power, when you can never get through to an actual person who gives you a specific explanation of, we were concerned about this remark that Cariati made during the interview, or this part that starts at minute 46 was what caused you to get flagged. You never hear an answer like that. So both the removal and the reinstatement appear only arbitrary, and no meaningful reasons are ever given one way or the other. And that kind of exercise of raw and arbitrary power over public discourse, I think, should be of concern to anyone who cares about free speech and science and civil discourse in a free society. And the second thing, I'll just echo your remarks that the consensus is very often wrong. Read the history of medicine, read the history of science. Classic example from the history of medicine. And this is how most medical breakthroughs occur. It starts with challenging a consensus. Famous physician who challenged the notion that gastric ulcers are caused by stress. And this crazy guy said, I think they're caused by a bacterial infection in the stomach. And people thought he was nuts. He couldn't get published in the peer-reviewed medical journals. They banned him from speaking at the medical society. Everyone pounced on him as a quack. And guess what? He turned out to be right. And now the conventional wisdom in medicine is if you have gastric ulcers, you need to get on antibiotics to get rid of this bacteria called H. pylori, which contributes to most cases of gastric ulcers. So yesterday's unconventional opinion becomes today's conventional wisdom. That is the recurrent theme in the history of science. That is the recurrent theme in the history of medicine. New ideas always bump up against that kind of resistance from established interests that have reasons that they want to maintain the status quo. And that kind of skepticism is fine, so long as those alternative voices are given a fair hearing, so long as you can continue to offer hypotheses, test them out, try to refute them, then we can advance. But when that process becomes sort of corrupted or shut down, then advancement stalls. And that strikes me as something that nobody on either side of these debates should want to happen.
So I agree with all that. And then to add to it, I've always said that additionally, journalism is nearly impossible to do on this platform, where the censorship, not just this platform, but any of the platforms that are censoring information, because journalism is the same as science in that regard. It requires the constant questioning of popular narratives and bringing new information forth. And it shouldn't be propaganda that everybody's saying. That there shouldn't necessarily be a restriction to consensus with journalism, especially either, because journalism is about telling people something new, and you can't do that if all you're doing is just spouting off what everybody else already thinks. So, Dr. Carey, thanks for doing this. We'll see what happens in the future, but I'll just give a forewarning to everybody who has you on as a guest. You got to be careful with this guy.
Thanks, Allison, and thank you for continuing to be a real journalist in a difficult climate.